At the beginning of this century, millions of desperate people escaped from the tyrannies of Europe and became part of the greatest mass migration in human history. They were headed for the promised land, America. Supposedly a paradise of liberty and opportunity. But before entering the gates of paradise, the new arrivals had to pass through a processing station in the middle of New York Harbor. Ellis Island is where many of my ancestors, and possibly many of yours, first set foot in the United States. Immigrants often arrived on America's doorstep with no money, one suitcase, and an abundance of hope. Our story of Ellis Island includes the long journey across the Atlantic Ocean. In advertising posters, steamship lines showed passengers partying their way to America. But for some immigrants, the trip to the New World was filled with danger, disease, and occasionally even death. Join us as the History Channel looks at the epic journey of millions who left their homelands for a new life in America, a life that began on Ellis Island. In the state of New York, off the island of Manhattan, sits a place that played host to many of the world's seekers, dreamers, and escapees.
All the town knew we were going to America, and they were all excited for us that we were going to America.
I can remember my last day in school in Harlem. I was paraded around the school as the young boy who was going to America.
We came because we were afraid. And when you come right down to it, we were the lucky ones because we got out alive.
They came from everywhere with very little, but what they lacked in personal possessions, they made up in abundant hopes for a better life in the promised land.
We came with nothing, we left nothing, we had nothing. And what we came to was the treasure itself. We'd be a family united again, we could live again.
Over 12 million embarked on the arduous journey that could last from a few long days to several stormy months.
It was a miserable condition, but they were shipping cattle from Europe to America. They were two-legged ones, human cattle.
Over a 62-year period, they entered the harbor. Their first sight was the well-known symbol that embodied the spirit of their new home.
I was very happy when we was coming to see liberty. Everybody clapped their hands and said, "That's America, this is liberty."
Oh, it was exciting. Everybody cheered, America! America, my God, everybody's yelling, crying, kissing, and who can remember? You weren't aware that this was a historical moment, but it was.
When they finally disembarked, it was here they took their first step on American soil. It was here they hoped to pass through the Golden Door. It was here a small island would become a legendary landmark. Here was Ellis Island.
I remember my father putting his arms around my mother and the two of them standing a while and crying. And my father said to my mother, "You're in America now, and you have nothing to be afraid of." But nothing at all.
4 out of every 10 Americans can trace their ancestry to the people that came through Ellis Island. It is a shrine to those who came to America in search of a better life.
Ellis Island carries with it a kind of symbolic baggage that other places don't carry, in part because one of our main national symbols and monuments is located right next to it.
Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
We heard this tremendous rumble, so my father and I ran out to the deck, and there were people of all denominations, some on their knees making the sign of the cross, Jews in their prayer shawls. As we were passing the Statue of Liberty, it was the first time I saw it. It was a great sight.
The Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island. I mean, those two things went together. And then for the people who came here, obviously, Ellis Island was a gateway. They got in. But it was a frightening place because it was also known that this is where you really got looked at. And I mean looked at, to see if you were fit to come into the United States.
During its history, Ellis Island would process the paperwork of immigrants from all over the world. There were those from England, Ireland, Germany, Italy, Poland, Sweden, Austria-Hungary, Turkey, Armenia, Romania, Russia, Greece, and the Caribbean. They were all part of a huge migration that began late in the 19th century and lasted into the early part of the 20th century. To regulate the huge wave of people washing in over the Atlantic, the federal government amassed both men and material to try and maintain control.
We had never undertaken a bureaucratic task as large as coping with immigration, and the United States decided to build a flagship immigration depot in the busiest port in the country, and that was the Port of New York. So it built a large, majestic immigration depot that was capable of processing thousands of immigrants every day.
Once the buildings were complete, the Ellis Island of history began to unfold.
That was our first home in this country. That was our first home. And it was a very important step. I mean, everything revolved Ellis Island.
Ellis Island was, for many people, before they ever came here, a legendary kind of thing. They had heard through word of mouth and through letters home what it would be like. And you have to remember that for many individuals coming from rural areas, they simply were not accustomed to that kind of bureaucratic contact, asking of questions. So it was frightening.
The Tsar doesn't live in a place like this. And this is, in a sense, where American officialdom lives. So it represents a kind of awesome view of America in that sense. But it is also a dangerous place because that's where they're going to decide your fate.
On Ellis Island, enormous expectations were heightened by the intensity of families reuniting after as much as years apart.
My father came running through the turnstile, and he squatted on his knees with his arms outstretched, and the 5 of us ran into his arms, and we were kissing and hugging. We were so happy to be together. And he said, "We're all together now. We'll never be apart again."
For others, Ellis Island was their last chance.
I was dreaming, if they sent me back, I'm going to
fall into the river and die. I couldn't go back anymore.
Memories like these are the foundation from which Ellis Island built its reputation as the Isle of Hope, the Isle of Tears. In the end, only 2% of the almost 13 million that passed through here were turned away.
There's something we should understand. That Ellis Island was momentary entry. They were going to America. It was sort of, you might say, the foyer through which we entered a vast new continent. And none of us quite knew where the hell it was all going to end.
From 1892 until 1954, Ellis Island was America's principal immigration station. It was located in the harbor of the country's busiest commercial port. For many shipping companies, Ellis Island was the place to offload their human cargo. Here, millions of immigrants began their new lives.
You could come through in Boston, you could come through actually through Halifax, you just come across the border. You could come through Philadelphia, you could come through Baltimore, you could come through Charleston, New Orleans, Galveston. But the overwhelming constant about immigration in the 19th century is that it is New York.
By the beginning of the 20th century, thanks to visiting relatives and letters home, New York was known throughout the world. It was described as the incredible city that possessed all kinds of big buildings. For many, New York was the heart of America, and Ellis Island was the gateway there. By the middle of the 20th century, 75% of all those who wanted to turn their dreams into a reality had come into the country right here. For shipping companies, immigration was big business. Eventually, they would be affected by strict laws from Washington, but still, transporting these passengers was extremely profitable.
The steamship companies themselves developed the first sort of package deals, where somehow if you made it to a transit town, they would package you on a train, usually in terrible third-class conditions, which gave you a taste of what it was going to be like on the boat.
The cost of a ticket to travel as cargo to the United States was about $12 in 1890, or what would be the equivalent of about $150 today. For many, this was an exorbitant amount of money, but it was a price worth paying to begin a new life.
The better classes, the upper classes, didn't go unless there was very, very unusual circumstances. In short, one of the more striking characteristics of immigration was the extent to which it recruited populations of people who literally were willing to do something that I think no one today would be prepared to do, which is to cross the Atlantic Ocean in what would be the equivalent of a tugboat and saying, well, bless me, here I go.
They came from Europe in droves, leaving behind a sense of despair. Throughout the years, the reasons they fled varied, but strangely, the stories always seemed to stay the same. The immigrants of America all shared a common goal: survival. They fled economic struggle, war, famine, political oppression, and religious persecution. And in America, they planned to start anew.
When immigrants came, no matter which group, they were making a conscious decision to rupture their source of origins and to begin the process of reinventing an identity. The nature of the American identity is one of choosing. That's a remarkable aspect of the experience.
Immigration to America began back in the early 17th century when the English created permanent settlements in the British colonies. The first to arrive came in family groups, as free individuals or as indentured servants.
As an indentured servant, you could not afford the cost of the transportation, which meant you signed, in effect, a contract with a ship captain who agreed to transport you to the New World, in return for which you gave him the right to sell your labor.
As indentured servants, people would spend a minimum of 4 years. For most, it was a small price to pay for the end rewards, which were freedom, a lot of land, and by far a better way of life.
About 75% of all the people who came between 1607 and, let's say, 1790, somewhere about 1,200,000. That particular population, be blunt, they were poor, people with very small opportunity in the country from which they came.
Throughout the 1700s, poor immigrants from Scotland, Ireland, Germany, and other northern European countries had settled in the British colonies. And while they were creating their new way of life, another culture was sold into American history. Enslaved Africans were one of the largest and most tragic migrations to arrive in the colonies.
The importation of slaves really explodes in the latter part of the 17th century and continues literally through to approximately 1770, and then it peters off. But the core populations were from the northwestern part of Europe and a very sizable chunk from Africa.
In the 1700s, migration was constant. However, the growth in population was due not to the dramatic influx of foreigners, but rather the high birth rate.
The United States wasn't regarded as really a very pleasant place to be. Foreign diplomats regarded it as a hardship post. It was regarded as a difficult place to live, and certainly not the kind of place that masses of immigrants wanted to come to.
For more than 200 years, few immigrants came into the country. Then in the 19th century, things changed. Distressing world events had caused the people of both Northern and Western Europe to leave home, and for many, America was the place to plant new roots.
By the mid-1840s, it was a flood. Irish fleeing the famine, Germans fleeing the effects of the Industrial Revolution and the political revolutions of the 1840s. And so America began its first really large wave of immigration.
Between 1840 and 1860, 4.5 million immigrants came to the United States. Within that time, New York's population grew from 400,000 to an alarming 1 million. And this massive explosion of people was cause for concern.
The most fascinating thing about immigration is there was no comprehensive body of immigration law until actually 1882 and 1890. In fact, if you said to me what would be the primary condition of coming to the United States before 1890 for Europeans, it would be if you can get aboard the ship and survive the journey and get off, you're home free.
After the Civil War, the U.S. government kept watch over immigration, but the responsibility of inspection and interrogation was left to each individual state. New York, being the busiest entryway in the country, tried to handle the problem of regulating immigration with a groundbreaking solution. In 1855, they turned a government-owned fort, Castle Clinton, into the immigration station known as Castle Garden.
What you're dealing with is a facility which establishes a very interesting idea. It was there because it was on an island. It meant, therefore, there was at least some control.
Castle Garden was designed to protect both the American public and the thousands of immigrants arriving daily. By separating them, state officials hoped to keep the ill out and the innocent away from the New York swindlers. The island's effectiveness set the stage for its successor. For 4 decades, it was the primary place to process thousands of immigrants, a job it did remarkably well until the end of the 19th century, when another large swell of would-be Americans were on the horizon. By 1882, state officials feared the worst, and the federal government was worried too. The time had come for Washington to assume complete control.
There was a concern that the United States would become the hospital, the great hospital of the nations of the earth, or, worse yet, perhaps, the poorhouse of the nations of the earth. And so the United States decided that immigration was such an important matter, it wanted to assume the responsibility of counting, interrogating, and medically inspecting immigrants coming to this country.
The first Comprehensive Immigration Act establishes categories of exclusion. So health becomes a condition for exclusion. Past history in terms of criminality. Moral behavior is a condition for exclusion. Anyone who's suspected of being a political radical. In short, the categories of exclusion become a way of siphoning off from the immigrant population those people that the country perceives as being dangerous.
Each law signaled a growing need to develop a more efficient way of enforcing the new legislation. By 1890, a $500,000 idea had taken shape, and that idea would become a history-making reality within 2 years' time. It took a little more than a year and a half to transform Ellis Island from a 3-acre lot of land into the nation's premier immigration station. Finally, on January 1st, 1892, the gateway to America was officially opened, and through its doors came the first immigrant.
The honor was reserved for a little rosy-cheeked Irish girl. She was Annie Moore. As soon as the gangplank was run ashore, Annie tripped across it. When the little voyager had been registered, Colonel Weber presented her with a $10 gold piece. It was the largest sum of money she had ever possessed. The New York Times, January 2nd, 1892.
For 5 years, the immigration station on Ellis Island played host to thousands of immigrants. Then in June of 1897, the unthinkable happened. The majestic buildings made of Georgia wood burned to the ground. Without hesitation, the federal government was determined to rebuild. Only this time, the nation's premier immigration station would be even better than before. At the incredible cost of $1.5 million, new structures made of fireproof materials were designed. 2 years later, the buildings that still stand upon the island today had risen out of the rubble.
The new station is an imposing as well as pleasing addition to the picturesque waterfront of the metropolis. The New York Times, 1900.
On December 17, 1900, Ellis Island was again in operation, but it was not without its problems.
It was oftentimes badly managed, badly organized. People responsible were not really given the proper training to perform the job they had to perform. And you have a highly vulnerable population who can be ripped off. The Commissioner of Immigration, William Williams, with the full support of the new President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, says, we gotta clean this pit out. And essentially what you can say is that the process became one of emphasizing efficiency.
After Williams successfully ended the corruption, Ellis Island handled the task of immigration considerably well. For years, it was the place where the wishes of millions were either granted or denied.
You have to imagine people leaving their homes and really being very uncertain about the future And then having this final test, it's almost like something out of a child's story where you have all these tests to become a knight. Every time you think you've made it, somebody hits you over the head with something. Well, Ellis Island has a little bit of that quality. So it had this quality of fear as well as this place of promise.
It was like heaven. It was like actually heaven. It was beautiful. And they treated us so royally. I didn't even want to get off of it.
It was a moment of tremendous concern, hearing all these stories about families being separated because either they had lice in their hair or they had glaucoma or for some other reason that they wouldn't permit them to stay in this country. They were shipped back to wherever they came from.
Although the time spent on Ellis Island was often frightening, it was an experience many had to endure. These were people longing for distance between themselves and their former lives.
Ellis Island, when we came here, and when all those people came here, it was also for the purpose of wanting a better life. But the background there for most of those peoples was the sadness. There was sadness in that building then.
For some, there was the sadness of the past. For others, there was the opportunity for a better future.
The journey to America was about liberty, but it was also about making a living. And when immigrants came here, they had very little. And the hope was that the children, and certainly the grandchildren, would really achieve the American dream.
In the early 20th century, words like liberty, freedom, and independence had real meaning. They became the driving force that propelled immigrants toward a new world.
Most of the immigrants who came during that period were people who were from countries that were not yet industrialized. They were beginning to industrialize, and a lot of people were being pushed off the land. Well, once you get uprooted from your village in a rural area and you start looking for work, moving to a foreign country is not that different than moving to some big city. So moving to America was another step, but it was one step in a series of steps for many people.
Around the turn of the century, many of the world's countries were part of an economic boom, and the United States was among them. Suddenly, America's big businesses found themselves in need of a plentiful supply of low-cost labor, and low-cost labor came in the form of immigrants.
We were competing with the Canadians, with the Australians, with the Brazilians, and the Argentinians, and the South Africans for the immigrants. We got the largest number, and we were regarded as the country that had the highest wages and the most desirable political system, but we were involved in a competition.
This was a competition the United States wanted to win, and to help sell the idea that America really was the land of opportunity, the country's industries launched an advertising campaign, and immigrants truly believed the propaganda.
I thought it was some kind of great paradise, a heaven, a place where nobody did any work. The streets were made of gold. You didn't have to work, you just dug the money up from the streets and you lived. Everybody was rich in America, even the maids had maids.
The economic opportunities that America offered often had personal consequences. Husbands, brothers, fathers, and sons made the difficult decision to set out over the sea. Fortunately for most, the choice was one worth making, and the time apart was only temporary.
My father knew there was a bigger world, and he wanted to be part of it, and he wanted to be something other than just a farmer, so he decided he would come to America.
During the peak years of immigration, Ellis Island was both America's entryway as well as an emotionally charged location where many reunions took place.
There was very little joy or cheerfulness in the life growing up in that small town in the first 10 years of my life. And I felt this was day number one, that I had a father that I could go to. I had a father I could call Dad. I had a father, period.
The United States had presented itself as an oasis of security to an uncertain world. For American industries, this was an effective method for building a powerful economy. But a mass of foreigners living within the United States was not a concept everyone embraced.
Look, at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty, there's a poem by Edmund Lazarus that says, "Send me the refuse of your teeming shore. Welcome, garbage." They were wanted here to perform the labor that had to be done, but you didn't want them as your neighbors.
During the first years, Ellis Island was enjoying its status as a successful bureaucratic invention. More and more laws were established to try and appease those that opposed the influx of foreigners coming into the country. And those laws affected both the immigrants and the companies responsible for transporting them across the ocean. By the 1880s, the majestic sailing vessels of the past were replaced by ships with steam-powered engines. And the invention of these fast-moving vessels affected the journey to America. The same Atlantic crossing that had previously taken 1 to 3 months was greatly reduced to an average of 8 to 14 days, depending on weather, and the passage was made affordable. These were changes that affected not just emigrants, but shipping companies as well. The steamliners en route to America to pick up exports were light in freight. This left room enough for thousands of people to be packed on board during the westbound voyage.
Some people felt that they could not make this trip in this boat. I couldn't understand that, I remember, because I thought that it was going to America and it was wonderful. That's what I've been looking for all the time for so many years. I knew it was uncomfortable, and I didn't care.
Transporting immigrants was lucrative, but not without restrictions from Washington. And these restrictions were known as passenger laws, specifically developed to make the steamship companies responsible for a pre-screening of every potential passenger while in the port of embarkation.
If you were brought across the ocean by a company and were found to be suffering from a disease, you would be sent back. That works. The companies went out of their way to make sure they didn't bring these people over. In other words, the cost factor was enough to persuade the companies that they didn't want sizable chunks of their immigrant populations being people they would have to transport back home.
By forcing shipping lines to transport back any person seen as unfit, and by fining them a hefty $100 per rejected person, the federal government tried to reduce the number of people that would have to be deported.
The idea is let the Europeans know that the United States is not going to let their riffraff get in. You also begin to find an increasing cooperation between the various police departments, like premature Interpol. That means, for example, that governments are going to start getting very interested in what are these people who are coming? We don't want the jailbirds.
Before departing for America, the shipping companies were required to give medical examinations, have baggage fumigated, and give antiseptic baths to their passengers. For the shipping companies, this was merely a part of the business of transportation. However, for many foreign hopefuls, this could be an unpleasant part of the process of immigration.
Everyone had to go to this station. So I went in the morning,
went down, there was a terrific crowd there, all waiting to be examined. I was passed, but my sister and her friend went down to the hall that I was in there. They were putting the whole crowd through showers. They must have been cold showers, because I could hear the screaming as I was sitting outside. I was glad I got through early in the morning.
Prior to departure, another responsibility of the shipping companies was a record of the immigrants that were aboard each vessel and the result of their medical exams. This record is known as the passenger ship list or the ship's manifest. The ship manifest is a reliable index of those that came to America during the years Ellis Island was in operation, and the numbered tags seen in the brims of men's hats and pinned to the clothes of women and children in many of the historic photographs directly correspond to the manifest and line number where each individual's information could be found.
The passenger ship manifests are really incredible documents because, number one, they're, for the most part, available today. Number two, they're not even written here. They were written in the old country. And number three, they're written in English. They contain all kinds of incredible information about our ancestors, including things like the street addresses they came from in the old country, the amount of money they had in their pockets.
While the manifests were prepared and the liners were readied, the emigrants were housed in seaport hotels that were owned by the shipping companies. The hotels were similar to dormitories, and it was here that many of the medically checked and deloused individuals spent an average of 4 days.
Then, sometime around 36 hours before the boats departed, you were deloused again. And your belongings, to some degree, were deloused again. And you were brought into what's called the clean side of the hotel. You were quarantined. You couldn't go out again. So after you were quarantined, they would figure out what you had with you.
Once the information was recorded, the immigrants would board the ships. They would then spend the following days as passengers in one of 3 classes. There was a first and second class, and then there was the most inexpensive and uncomfortable way to travel, steerage. This was the area located on the lower deck where the ship's steering mechanism had once been housed, and there over 1,000 people at a time would make the trek across the sea.
There was no separate quarters for sleeping. You stayed with your clothes on through the trip. You couldn't get your clothes off or anything. You just slept where they put you there, you know. So it was a very miserable thing, but they had to endure that in order to get here.
Even though accommodations were at times dreadful, the buoyant spirits of the emigrants could not be broken. They were bound for the new world, and there are countless tales of their experiences. The stories are filled with joyful expectations that were often threatened during fearful adventures. And sometimes it seemed as if their dreams, as well as their lives, would be washed away at sea. During the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, many immigrants had never before been beyond the boundaries of their small villages. And yet there they were, sea voyagers, who were caught in the tangle of ethnicity, bound for America.
You never saw anything so tremendous and so big, you know. It was unbelievable that such a tremendous thing can be on water, you know. And where we were, below, it was all kinds of nationalities, all kinds of people. Some were wearing these fez hats, and Egyptians and Turkish, and we wanted to be friends with them, but there was no communication. All we knew was if somebody patted us on the head or gave us a hug, and they were friends.
Actually, my mother seemed very frightened the whole time. She'd never been out of that little town in her entire life, you know. And here she was getting on board a ship and surrounded with all these strange people that were speaking different languages also. And so it was kind of exciting. I knew that there was excitement all around me.
Depending on the year, the shipping company, and the class of the passenger, travel accommodations varied, and for many they were extremely unpleasant.
The water was so rough, everybody got seasick. There was nobody going to eat for about 2 days.
You had odors of paint, you had odors of food, people got sick, all these odors combined.
We were always in line, everything was a line. We always were queuing up for one thing or another. Conditions were horrible on the ship.
Despite the horrible conditions on ship, the emigrants were often lighthearted. These were people brimming with hope, and that hope would frequently spill out onto the liner's wooden decks.
Up on deck was a great place to go dancing. We had a great time. We had to go up there, we had to dance all the Irish dances, the old-fashioned dances and everything. And we saw the captain, and we were greenhorns from Ireland, and we didn't know anything.
I think everybody enjoyed themselves. They were not being forced to take this trip. It was something that they wanted to do, you know, to start life in America.
Freedom was just an ocean away, but many times the tumultuous seas threatened to drown the vessels crammed with those in search of a dream.
It was all pretty much a day-to-day thing until we ran into a storm. That, I think, was when it's really impressed me that we were doing something big and that it was just not a day-to-day thing.
It was awful. The boat was rocking and big fishes used to jump, almost coming to the boat.
It sounded as if the boat was heading some rocks, or the great waves would smash. The noise tremendous, and I thought we would flounder at any moment.
I can remember that there was a lot of crying, and people were saying, "We're never going to reach America."
For the majority of immigrants, the best part of the journey was its end. And for those entering the port of New York, there was no question they had made a successful voyage once they saw the copper-clad colossus who personified the essence of America.
There was really excitement, and some of the people were crying and everything. They could saying, there she is, and I didn't know who was there. And then my mother lifted me up, and I saw the Statue of Liberty.
They were screaming, "La libertad, la libertad, viva la libertad, viva la libertad." So everybody ran up deck, and everybody was around the rails, you know, and pointing at the Statue of Liberty.
People knew through hearsay in Europe that when they approached the harbor, they would see this enormous statue, which also happens to represent American liberty, American freedom. Many of these people who came here from the old world never experienced anything like that before. So it's a very dramatic moment in the memory of immigrants, some of whom were children, some of whom were adults.
I knew this guy, and he was coming from Russia. And he says, "Here is the beautiful lady." He says, "I was waiting all my life to get here. She's welcoming us." I turn around, look at him, and the tears are coming from his eyes. I started to cry, too.
I can't tell you the feeling that we had. We were so happy, and we started to sing. We sang Hungarian. In America, life is golden. In America, it's never dark. In America, there's a lot of money. In America, the girl is happy. In America, the world is much better. In America, living is golden. And that's what I'm longing to be, my dear.
The Statue of Liberty, with her torch held high, cast light on the final waterway that led to the Golden Door. In the distance was the final testing ground before entering the Promised Land, Ellis Island, the legendary Isle of Hope, Isle of Tears. On one of his trips to America, the Scottish writer Robert Louis Stevenson sailed aboard an immigrant ship. He was traveling second class, but made a point of visiting the steerage section, about which he wrote this: "The stench was atrocious. To descend on an empty stomach was an adventure." But the voyage was hardly the end of the story, and newcomers who landed on Ellis Island weren't yet home free. They still had to be checked for disease, physical and mental. Immigrants who were deemed defective could be sent right back where they came from.